Good morning.
Good morning.
You'll notice Drex isn't here, for what that's worth. So all talks have to have objectives. We're going to discuss two things today, awake operations and intraoperative MRI. They often go together, but both of them have anesthetic implications, and then we're going to stop the talk. There's a danger when giving a talk like this. When I go hear talks given by people in their field and I'm not in their field, generally they use lingo and concepts that overshoot my knowledge. So I'm going to undershoot. So if I talk about a bunch of stuff you know already, bear with me because it's on purpose. But I don't like it when the basics I don't know. So we're going to talk about brain surgery, specifically surgery of the brain itself, not of stuff around it. Our department divides sort of intracranial surgery into 4 different ways of doing things, and we have 4 different people that do them so that hopefully we get a lot of experience. Pete Pahapel does functional stuff, so people with Parkinson's, people with pain, people with tremor get brain procedures to try and alleviate these, what can be very disabling symptoms. So he's out of this one. Rafael Sacco does vascular stuff, so blood vessels are sort of around the brain until they get into the PIA. And they involve both extraoperative techniques and intraoperative techniques, and it's a whole field, and he does it beautifully. Recently, we added Nate Zwagerman from University of Pittsburgh. University of Pittsburgh has chiseled out a position in neurosurgery where they are the finest institution for doing surgery of the skull base. So basically benign tumors that grow up into the brain space but aren't necessarily of the brain. And really there's nobody else in second place, so we had to wait a couple years to get him. We're happy to get him. He's well trained. He's doing a great job. And then we got the stuff I do, which is working on the brain itself. So when you work on the brain, some areas of the brain are very dedicated to specific functions. If it isn't there, the function won't happen. Many other areas of the brain are involved with different functions, but not necessarily in ways where they have to be there. And so when I'm taking stuff out, that's my major sort of skill that I better have, is figuring out what you need to keep and what can go. With both epilepsy surgery and malignant brain tumor surgery, there's a lot of sort of non-class 1 data that shows that extended resection matters, so the more you can get, the better, as long as you leave them okay. And the leave them okay part is important because for malignant gliomas, for instance, if people have deficits, they won't live as long as people who don't, in a real interesting way. So a big part of neurosurgery in my little world is trying to localize function. We do that preoperatively with this whole array of stuff, some of which was developed at our institution. The first is structural imaging. We didn't develop that, so regular MRI scans and then knowledge of where stuff is supposed to be, okay? The supposed to be part can be helpful, but it's not great. You don't want to make major decisions based on that because we all have a lot of variety how our brains are arranged, which looking around the room you might expect it to, yeah, that makes sense. And if you take a cruise through Flipboard, you'll find all kinds of innovations and findings that none of us who study the brain a lot know about, but every day it's like, oh my God, we can do this. Mostly based on fMRI data. So functional MRI is looking at blood flow in the brain. Your department has a long history with it. The institution does. And it's interesting that in that it'll show us areas of the brain that are involved in a process. It won't show us whether they're necessary or not, and it won't show us how involved they are. There's a bunch of neuropsychological stuff we do. We do neuropsych testing. If you see deficits, sort of subtle deficits that people have compared to normals, and it seems like by their life accomplishments, they probably didn't have those in the past. It's probably related to the lesion, whatever it is. WADA testing it's not an acronym. It's named after some dude named WADA. And it's putting half the brain to sleep sequentially and testing basically for language and memory, seeing which half of the brain is dominant for that. We do a lot of functional MRI. We do a lot of MEG. Diffusion tensor imaging has actually revolutionized my world. It's looking at white matter in the brain. fMRI is great for looking at the cortex, but most stuff goes down into the brain, and the cortex only just gets you at the beginning. So the white matter mapping has been extremely useful, and again, in terms of trying to get people through operations and not hurt them. And then we do extra and intraoperative cortical stimulation. It's stimulating the brain specifically in different areas while doing different tasks to see if we can interrupt them. It's called a gold standard. I think it's more of a lead standard. It's the best we have, but it's not that great, because when we stimulate the brain, we stimulate the area we're stimulating, and we can also stimulate large networks that are associated with that area. So again, it'll get us an idea of what's involved, but not necessarily what's necessary. This is looking just at language, not at speech. This is based on fMRI data done by Jeff Binder here and his graduate students, mostly with our epilepsy patients. So step one of this is that these folks have epilepsy. We assume their brains are arranged normally. They typically are, but it's not necessarily something we can predict for tumor patients who might develop something in midlife. So we see a whole lot of the dominant hemisphere and the non-dominant hemisphere can be invoked in language function. If it were all necessary for language function and for good neuropsychological health, if you will, we wouldn't be able to operate. But the reality is that although these areas are involved in really interesting ways that we don't have a lot of information on the how of, a lot of this function can be made up for or transferred or something. There's a great area up here, I mean great if you live in my world, called supplementary motor area. In the dominant hemisphere, if for good reasons we take it out, people will be hemiparetic and mute for up to a week, and then eventually regain total function. So when we do fMRI studies, and we do them time-locked, or when we do MEG studies, which is really exquisitely time-locked, it's magnetoencephalography. We can go down to hundreds of seconds with MEG. With fMRI, you can go down to fractions of minutes. This area will be invoked before the motor area will. So it has traditionally been thought to be involved with planning of complex movements. The motor area will give you a single muscle group. The supplementary motor area will start to really refine that, and then the cerebellum will go to town on really refining it. But what's going on during that week when we take this thing out and they look terrible? It's a real job like prepping the families for how bad this is going to look. And you never feel good until they look good, trust me. What's going on during that week? Where does that function go to? Well, when we do fMRI studies afterwards, the other side looks like it's invoked, but we don't know how that transfer is done. In other ways, when people have different arrangements in their brain, it's very possible to have circuitry that's both adaptive and maladaptive. So epilepsy, which used to be thought to be due to a bad spot, sort of, if we could only identify that spot, we could stop the seizures, now looks more and more like it's complex circuits that are learned. The brain learns how to have seizures, and the longer it has at learning this, the more complex they can be, which is why, 15 years ago we started operating on little kids instead of waiting for them to be adults before we operated, because it was kind of sad waiting that long for no good reason. So this is what diffusion tensor imaging can look like. There's many different ways to display it. We tend to use 3 color maps here. Each one of these colors denotes a different direction. So red would be going across the brain. In this view, blue is going from superior to inferior, and green is going from back to front. So different things we can tell is these are motor areas. These are motor white matter areas. So although the motor areas are on the surface of the brain, they've got to get to the spinal cord somehow, and when we see how, that helps us be safe with surgery. It helps in an amazing way, actually. This is part of a superior longitudinal fasciculus, which is sort of I'm told I have a good head for showing this stuff, so I'm going to use it. It's a sort of a U-shaped thing that in simple terms takes frontal speech areas and associates them with posterior temporal and parietal language areas. So if we have language back here and we have speech up here, it has to hook up somehow, and those are ways that it hooks up. A surprising amount of tumors will invoke one of these two systems, at least a surprising amount that I see. This is a typical operating room setup. For those of you who don't get to an operating room, which there must be one in the room here. The important thing is this is a neuropsychologist. This is Dave Sapsovitz. He's a guy I work closely with. And patient's awake. Dave's tucked up under there talking to the guy. We have sort of a little tent we make. And meanwhile, we're working on his head. And so that little tent is to keep things as clean as possible. The idea of a sterile operating room is a little naive. I mean, we try and make it as clean as we can, but you know, we're in a world too, and every once in a while a fly shows up or something. Dave's created this tablet-based app system where he can do quick neuropsych testing. He gets to see what he's showing. The patient has a screen up here seeing what he's doing. And then when I stimulate, we test up to 5 things sequentially at each site. This stimulation before this app used to take about an hour and a half, and now we can sort of knock it off in 15 minutes. And it's not all about, you know, surgeons love their time, quick, but these people are awake, and there's a limited amount of time that you can keep them awake and still have them perform at sort of good function. So being quick during the awake part matters a lot. I'm going to let Tony talk about the intraoperative MRI part. But just one thing, when we're doing intraoperative MRI, what we're doing is we're operating, we're stopping when I think I've done what I want to accomplish, we're sterilely taking a break, getting an MRI scan, coming back, and either doing more or closing. Okay, so keeping things clean matters, and this sort of pathetic baggy system's been developed where you basically put a sack over it, okay, and it's a clean sack and it's a rubber bander on it, and that rubber band better not come off. And this works great for people that are asleep. It doesn't work well for people that are awake at all. Putting a bag on somebody's head without an airway, probably a bad idea. So what we do then is we close the case, dress it, and then if we need to go back, we just open it again. It adds 10 minutes to the case. This is what our intraoperative MRI scanner looks like. It's the best toy I've ever gotten since a BB gun, maybe better. Because I'm going to invite my world a little bit. So I operate on a bunch of people, and we get MRIs the next day, and then I look and I see, oh my God, I wish I would have done more. You know, and that's a very disheartening thing. It doesn't happen every day. I'm not that bad at it, but it happens often enough that when the idea of being able to effectively integrate MRI into surgery came up, I pushed hard for it. The idea has been around since the 90s, and the first units were unworkable. The first GE unit, they only sold one ever. It was to Harvard, and it was 2 magnets with a space this big between them, and you had to sort of operate like this because the patient had to be in the magnet, and you had to use all non-metal tools, and they used it not very often at all. It sort of sat in occupied space at Mass General. There's a couple competing systems now. We went with GE because home team, you know, go Wisco, go. But also because theirs is the most flexible in terms of the magnet itself. We can upgrade the magnet without tearing the rooms apart. And the technology keeps changing, and we want to keep up with it. Tony and I have a well-coordinated talk. I just saw his slides this morning. So this is now it's 30. In our first 30 patients, we've gone back 4 times. Okay, so that's the justification for the whole thing, is that 4 times I would have looked at this and thought, gee, I gave these people a substandard operation by my criteria. What do I do about it? Do I do a whole nother anesthetic, OR time, risk, or do we just be happy with what we got? Well, it's considered state of the art. Our numbers aren't terrible compared to everybody else, but they're going to be better now. A real interesting sidelight that's happened with that I didn't see coming is, and it's probably a comment on me as much as the technology, people are going home quicker. And I think I'm probably making smaller approaches because I know the MRIs sort of got my back on the final product. So we have a lot of people going home next day now after pretty extensive brain surgery, which is really fun because, I mean, one of the joys you all don't do very often is going around every morning and seeing people you made sick. It's not a pleasant experience. You like them to look good, so the sooner they can look good, the better. Tony's going to talk basically about the anesthetic implications of the MRI scanner, because there's a bunch. It's a big magnet. It's a really big magnet, and bad things can happen if you don't take great care with it. It's separated in different rooms. They're right next to each other. I'm shocked at how well designed it is, to tell the truth. And why Tony? Well, the first group of cases we did, he was on his neuro rotation, and he took what seemed like extraordinary interest in it to me and helped us make it a smooth operation. This is really big, coordinated activity. You need everybody on the same page. The MRI techs have done an amazing job at sort of educating us all and making us slicker. The OR people have taken it on as their project, and Tony did too, so here he comes.
Well, good morning, everyone. Like Dr. Mueller said, I'm not claiming to be an expert in neuroanesthesia, and I'm not an expert in MRI, of course, but I just happened to be on a neuro rotation at the beginning of the year when we opened up this scanner, so I happened to be the person that was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or whatever you want to say, that got the joy of kind of learning how to do these cases when we first started them. So in the ever-expanding world of the third floor, that is our home, the intraoperative MRI suite is located in IPP 48. Most of you probably walk past it every day and don't even know that it's there. You can access the control room via the corridor right by the trauma elevators, and then the scanner itself is accessible from IPP 36 and 47. So we can do these cases in either one of those rooms and then bring patients into the scanner. Just a show of hands from the residents, who's done these cases so far? Okay, so there's a good amount, so you guys are already pros at this, but for the ones that haven't done them yet, this will help to just kind of demystify the process for the anesthesia side of things. So if you have done other cases in 36 or 47 and wondered what the heck is behind the giant door that says danger on it, that's where the scanner lives. PDC, the little logo down in the corner there, is another local Wisconsin company that built these doors custom for our facility. They are so proud of these doors that they have put up a YouTube video that just shows them opening and closing. So that, to my knowledge, is the only public publicity we have of the intraoperative MRI scanner, is the YouTube video of the doors closing. I don't have a lot of awesome pictures to show of action shots, so I had to kind of Photoshop our neuroanesthesia staff in. So here's Dr. Galapati peeking through the window as we view the scanner from inside the operating room itself. So the view of this picture is basically from where the operating room table sits. So this is literally how far the patients have to go. So this isn't a giant transport process down to MRI on the second floor or anything like that. So this is really an improvement in efficiency and safety for these patients. The goals of my part of the talk are kind of to talk about overall safety for our patients. This is obviously paramount. Our roles as anesthesiologists is just to keep people safe and get them through their surgeries. So we want to basically make processes that are safe for our patients when we're transporting somebody with an open cranium. Can be a little bit dicey under a general anesthetic. You also don't want to be the one that walks into the scanner with something metal and gets it sucked into a giant superconducting magnet. So this is about safety for all of us and the other medical personnel that are involved. And then, of course, to improve our efficiency for our surgeons, but also for our patients, to minimize their anesthetic time and minimize their operative time as well. These cases, you can really kind of break them down into several steps. Kind of simplifying it, we come down to preparing for the scan, transferring the patient to the scanner, the intraoperative MRI process itself, and then bringing the patient back to the operating room. They're not a whole lot different from your typical craniotomy in terms of your anesthetic plan. You're obviously going to tailor it to your specific patient, but there's just kind of this small transport process right in the middle. So at the beginning of the case, you will induce your patient as you normally do, again, tailored to them. Place your lines, intubation, and then really a lot of the prep comes kind of at the very beginning of the case. We place dual monitors on the patient, so we place our own monitors on the patient when we're putting them to sleep, and then after they're asleep, the MRI technicians, who Dr. Mueller mentioned, have done an excellent job throughout this whole process. They'll place MRI safe monitors on the patient. We can't bring our own monitors into the scanner, so the patients will have to have 2 monitors on them at the start of the case. Reason being, they will be really, really well secured to the table. So you won't have a whole lot of access to the patient's body throughout the case. Instead of our usual kind of one belt band across the patient, they have several belt bands, and they tend to kind of be wrapped up in sheets. So we tend to get all the monitors on them at the start of the case, just to make it more streamlined when we're actually moving the patient later on. So my advice is to just kind of straighten out everything, get your line secured well at the very beginning of the case. It'll just make your life a little bit easier when it gets to moving the patient. I put a picture of a scopolamine patch on here. So interestingly enough, there is an FDA warning against transdermal medications in patients that are undergoing MRI scans. A lot of transdermal meds have an aluminum backing on them, which can potentially conduct electricity and cause skin burns during scans. So try to avoid putting a scope patch on your patient for that reason, and also be aware of any other transdermal medications that the patient might be on. While I was able to find YouTube videos of doors opening and closing, I couldn't find any pictures of scope patch burns in MRIs, but apparently it is a possibility. When it comes down to if you have questions about what is safe to go in the MRI scanner versus what is not, there's international symbols for medical devices and all of our equipment that designates if something can go in an MRI scanner or not. So if you see an insert or a packaging that has this green box with MR in the middle, that is considered MRI safe for all MRI scanners. The yellow or black triangle with the MR in the middle is considered MRI conditional. So these are things that are tested and found to be safe for the vast majority of clinical scanners. If there's any questions about bringing those types of devices into a scanner, they can be directed towards the MRI staff themselves. And then intuitively, anything that's got a circle with a slash through it should not be brought into an MRI scanner. So our wonderful neuroanesthesia staff, Dr. Lauer, Dr. Connolly, and Dr. Linn, are all MRI safe, whereas Dr. Schmidt is maybe just conditional. Along these lines, the MRI safe pump is something that we use for these types of cases. It's the iRadimed 3860. These are the only devices that we can safely bring into the scanner. Our Alaris pumps and syringe pumps are not considered MRI safe. They have ferromagnetic components, so you cannot bring those into the scanner. You will be provided with these pumps at the beginning of the case. You'll get 2 of them. They both have two channels on them, so you can have up to 4 drips running. If for some reason you need more, there are other pumps available as well. They're a little clunky. For the most part, they're fairly intuitive to use, but they're not quite as easy as our Alaris pumps. But you can certainly figure out how to use them at the beginning of your case. When we first got these pumps, they did not have a drug library in them, so we had to program all of our drips in mils per hour. It was tedious and dangerous. They do now have a drug library. However, they lack the one drug that we use for almost all cranie cases, remifentanil. So you will have to program remifentanil in mils per hour. So be careful with your calculations. If you need to double check your math, you can always set up an empty syringe on one of our other syringe pumps and program in your patient's weight and your dose, and then that syringe will read off, that syringe pump will read off the mils per hour. So you can use that to double check your math. Here's the pump in action with Dr. Bayach and Dr. Wolk. Finally, before everybody goes into the scanner, they have to go through basically MRI screening. So you will be given a sheet of various questions that verifies that you don't have any metal devices or implanted devices in your body. You remove everything metal from your person, and then they'll do a metal detector wand check before you enter into the scanner. First case that I did here, I had a piece of gum in my pocket that had a foil wrapper, and that set the metal detector off, so it's pretty sensitive. When it comes down to actually transferring the patient, the surgeons will of course let you know that we're getting ready to head to the scanner. As Dr. Mueller said, they'll cover up the head in a sort of semi-sterile fashion. At this point, things kind of turn over to anesthesia as far as guidance on what to do here. So we've kind of streamlined it so that the process is a little more simple. You start up your MRI safe monitors. They'll be displayed on a portable monitor that you can wheel alongside the patient that looks just like this one on the screen. We pull all of our monitors off. As I said, our devices are not safe for the MRI scanner. So that means the EKG leads. Our blood pressure cuff can stay on this patient, but you have to remove the cable and pull the sticky pulse ox off the patient. At this point, you can transfer your sample line with your capnograph over to this monitor as well, and then disconnect your A-line cable. You can bring the A-line transducer that is considered MRI conditional. It is safe for our scanners. You can bring the transducer and the pressure bag into the room, but you won't be able to actually transduce your line because our cables are not MRI safe. But you can at least keep your A-line from clotting off. Try and get everything condensed onto just the MRI safe pole so that you're only wheeling one pole in with the patient. And at this point then, you don't want your patient bucking or moving, of course, so it's a good time to redose your neuromuscular blocker. Scans take anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes, so you've got a long period of time where you need the patient to absolutely not move. Obviously, if it's an awake cranie and you just have the patient under sedation, don't paralyze them. Bring any emergency drugs that you need. You can keep those in your pocket as long as they don't have needles on them. And then I usually add 2 to 3 circuit extensions to the circuit, which I'll kind of explain in a minute. The bed itself is a special MRI, intraoperative MRI bed, which has this kind of docking mode on it, and that'll line up with the transfer cart. Like Dr. Mueller mentioned, we're not the only institution in the country that does intraoperative MRI. There's a lot of different formats out there. This one involves a dedicated OR in which the MRI scanner is kind of parked in a shielded garage and is actually brought to the patient itself. That has its own implications. Some of the very first intraoperative MRI scanners feature this kind of double donut configuration like the one Dr. Badithi's operating in which the patient had to stay in the scanner the entire time. Ours is kind of one that maximizes the utilization of both the MRI suite and the operating room suite, allowing both to be used for things outside of their intraoperative MRI purposes. So our MRI suite is attached to the OR itself. Again, as I said, it's in IPP 48, and then 36 and 47 are the ORs that are attached to the MRI suite. This allows the MRI scanner to be used for other scans outside of surgical scans, and it allows the ORs to be used for cases outside of intraoperative MRI cases without having to keep non-ferromagnetic items in the room at all times and shielding the room and things like that. So this schematic kind of overviews what ours looks like. So when it comes time to transferring the patient, you will move them from the dedicated OR bed onto this portable cart. As I said, they kind of dock and they line up perfectly with each other. It's not like our usual kind of haphazard sliding patients from bed to bed. This is actually really smooth. The top of the OR table just kind of slides off onto the cart. And then you can wheel the patient just about to the doorway there. And this is what I was getting at with adding 2 or 3 circuit extensions to your anesthesia machine. This allows you to keep your patient on the ventilator and deliver a volatile anesthetic without having to switch over to propofol and try and bag the patient when they're under a sterile drape. So it allows you to keep your same vent settings and probably minimizes movement around the head. it's absolutely imperative that you as the anesthesia resident or anesthesia attending in the room kind of take the lead at this point, as you're obviously responsible for the airway and all the lines. So I can't emphasize it enough. Just try and kind of be the one who's in charge of directing the process of moving the patient. You can get about as far as the doorway, at which point then we'll usually just unplug the circuit, move it over to, there's an MRI safe anesthesia machine that is in the MRI suite, and then you can get the circuit close enough to plug into that. You can put the patient on your same vent settings. The machine in there only has isoflurane, so if you're running DES or SIVO, you just have to keep in mind that you're switching to a different volatile anesthetic, but otherwise you can keep everything else the same. We then move the transfer cart and dock it with the MRI table, and then slide the patient into the scanner. The whole process, when it goes smoothly, takes just maybe 5 minutes. So it can be relatively quick. Once the patient is in the scanner, everybody moves to the MRI control room, which is just adjacent to the scanner itself. We get this kind of little cubby to sit in. We've kind of claimed it as the anesthesia space. There's going to be a monitor right above your workstation. You can pull the patient's vitals into Epic automatically by switching your device to IPP48. And then basically we sit and monitor the patient from there. Obviously, for those of us that don't do a whole lot of kind of long distance anesthesia, this can be a little disconcerting being away from the patient, and it really kind of shows you the value of your monitors, especially when you have a sedated patient or a patient under MAC. I can't understate the importance of your capnogram in those situations. So there will be generally intermittent breaks in the scanning in which the technicians have to go in to inject contrast or to adjust things with the scanner. These are perfect opportunities to go inside if you need to adjust something with the patient. The MRI safe pumps do have a remote option, so we actually have remotes within the control room that we can control our pumps from. So that's an option for changing drips. But otherwise, again, you are primarily in charge of the patient's safety. So if there's anything going wrong with your patient, if they're decompensating, if you need to make a change to your ventilator, that supersedes the scan. And so they can pause the scan if you need to enter the room at any time. So again, speak up if you need to. When it comes down to bringing the patient back, we simply repeat the process in reverse. Again, anesthesia taking the lead as far as the rate and process of moving the patient. Once you get back in the room, put your old monitors back on the patient. You can get rid of the MRI safe monitors, and then depending on what Dr. Mueller needs to do, reopening or re-exploring the patient, they'll of course let you know. Overall, they're kind of fun cases, and we've tried to make things kind of as streamlined as possible. Any questions that you guys have, I'd be happy to answer, and Dr. Mueller could answer as far as the neuro side of things. Yeah.